Cornelius Vanderbilt discovered too late that the railroad he was buying could be printed. Every certificate he added to his empire was being multiplied in a back room on Wall Street. The man behind that operation was not an anonymous counterfeiter. It was Daniel Drew, the former cattleman turned banker, the man Vanderbilt had allowed to remain on the board as treasurer. While the tycoon believed he was cornering the market, Drew was printing illegal shares. The tycoon was buying paper that didn't exist until seconds before he paid for it. He lost more than $7 million. But it was no ordinary defeat. It was a public humiliation. A humiliation that no adversary on the rails had ever inflicted on him. This is not a story about trains. It is the story of how a treasurer, two allies, and a sold-out legislature used ink to take a railroad away from the most powerful man on the rails. And of how, in the end, the paper turned against them. The final figure, 50,000 illegal shares. But the true cost would not be measured in bills. The question is not whether Vanderbilt could afford that loss. He could. The question is how a handful of men without an empire, without a fleet, without the respect of Wall Street, accomplished what no honest competitor had ever accomplished, humiliating the Commodore. The Erie Railroad was no ordinary company. It had been built with public funds, but by the mid-1850s it was poorly managed and weighed down with debt. Daniel Drew was not an aristocrat of money. He was a former cattleman, pragmatic and ruthless, who had started driving cattle before learning to move stock. He lent $2 million to the company, took control of it, and from Wall Street amassed a fortune manipulating the price of its shares. By 1866, Cornelius Vanderbilt, owner of the New York Central Railroad, decided to absorb the Erie. He wasn't doing it out of vanity. He wanted to eliminate a competitor and extend his dominance over the Northeast. The Erie, with its strategic route, was the missing piece. He bought shares in silence, with the patience of a predator. He succeeded. No one noticed how the Commodore was sliding toward control. And he made a courtesy mistake. He allowed Drew to remain on the board as treasurer. What Vanderbilt didn't know was that Drew already had a plan so simple that it escaped any strategist, turning the printing press into a weapon. Between 1866 and 1868, Drew brought James Fisk and Jay Gould onto the board. The three conspired to issue fake Erie shares, a maneuver the financiers called watering the capital. The logic was cruel and simple. Each new share reduced the proportional value of the old ones, without the company generating a single additional asset. It was a machine for making nothing. They didn't need to rob a safe. All they had to do was print certificates and sell them to the man trying to buy the company. Vanderbilt swallowed paper thinking it was steel. Every bill he paid out fed his enemy's machine. They issued 50,000 illegal shares. Vanderbilt, believing each purchase brought him closer to control, acquired a large number. Every certificate he added diluted his position. When the tycoon understood the scam, it was already too late. He had lost more than $7 million in his attempt to control the company. Jay Gould returned most of it under threat of lawsuit, but Vanderbilt ceded control of the railroad to the trio. The lesson was bitter. On Wall Street, an adversary with a printing press can beat an empire with rails. But the trio wanted more. They wanted impunity. The trio didn't stop at the markets. They looked for protection in politics. What they achieved in Albany was more scandalous than the fraud itself. They linked up with the Tammany Hall machine and appointed William Boss Tweed as director of the Erie Railroad. Tweed paid handsomely. In the Albany state legislature, he got a law that legalized the fake shares retroactively. The illegal was made law with a single signature. Historian Gustavus Myers documented what followed: an auction in the corridors of the Capitol. Vanderbilt's agents and Gould's agents handed out money without disguise. Gould arrived with a suitcase carrying $500,000 in green bills. The cash flew fast. One senator accepted $75,000 from Vanderbilt and then $100,000 from Gould. He kept both sums and voted with Gould's dominant forces. It wasn't ideology, it was arithmetic. The fraud became indistinguishable from business. The line between bribery and the law had dissolved. The state had been sold for cash. But the legislative protection carried a cost the trio hadn't calculated. The war moved to the courts. Judge George G. Barnard, a Tweed puppet, issued an arrest warrant against Gould and his partners for violating a court order. The defendants didn't wait. They fled to Jersey City. The image of railroad owners running like criminals shook Wall Street. It was a scene no investor would forget. But justice sometimes comes by unexpected paths. However, puppets sometimes cut their own strings. In the fall of 1871, Barnard turned against Tweed. He facilitated the prosecution of the Tweed Ring. Not long after, the judge was removed and convicted of corruption, most of the charges tied to the Erie Ring. His fall dragged the entire ring down. The final blow came on March 11, 1872. The Erie Ring was broken. A new board of directors took control of the company. Jay Gould formally resigned as president on March 12. General John Dix took over the presidency, and beside him sat administrators, not raiders. The railroad was back in the hands of order. The rails were no longer the loot of card sharps. But the restoration didn't return the fortune to those who had printed the paper. The game wasn't over yet. The board was about to turn. Fisk and Gould betrayed Drew, once again manipulating the price of Erie stock. The maneuver cost him $1.5 million. Drew, the man who had taught Wall Street to water down capital, ended up watered down himself. He had invented the poison, and they drank it on him. The wheel of betrayal turned one last time. He declared bankruptcy in 1876, with debts exceeding $1 million and no viable assets. He died in 1879, dependent on his son. The swindler had been swindled. James Fisk didn't survive much longer. He was assassinated in 1872. Jay Gould, the cunning one of the trio, didn't escape the circle either. In September 1869, alongside Fisk, he had manipulated the gold market and triggered the panic of Black Friday. The panic sank confidence and stained his name forever. Years later, between 1872 and 1873, he was swindled by a British aristocrat, Lord Gordon Gordon, who stripped him of $1 million in stock, equivalent to $27 million in 2025. Public opinion despised him. Not even the dirtiest money buys forgetting. In 1878, the Erie Railway Company declared bankruptcy. It was reorganized as the New York, Lake Erie, and Western Railway Company. It changed its name. The scars, however, didn't disappear. There was a time when a printing press was worth more than a railroad, at least for a few weeks. But ink doesn't create wealth, it only changes hands. Vanderbilt lost more than $7 million. Drew died without assets. Gould was made a fool. The Erie War wasn't won by the most cunning. It was won by the institutional restoration that dismantled the ring. A hard lesson remains. Capitalism tolerates ambition. It doesn't tolerate counterfeiting. Because whoever prints shares to sink another ends up printing their own ruin. No press can erase the memory of the market, and diluted trust isn't restored with a new corporate name. The ink dries, but the distrust remains.